In the past decade or so, there have been very many indie games that have taken inspiration from classics that came out in the 80s and 90s, or just older eras of gaming as a whole, while also taking their own unique spin on the formula of those games presented. Some that come to mind are games like Freedom Planet, which celebrates the Sega Genesis era by being an amalgamation of elements from Sonic, Ristar, and Gunstar heroes, as well as Shovel Knight, which celebrates the NES era by being an amalgamation of elements from Mega Man, Mario 3, and DuckTales. And should I also mention the copious amounts of Metroidvanias and the sheer amount of Smash clones? You get the point I'm trying to make here. Now, if I may also bring to light a particular series from the 90s that has also had many games that tried to emulate its formula, that being Turrican. A series of games that consist of run-and-gun side-scrollers with an emphasis on explorable environments. There have been many attempts by modern indie devs to imitate the Turrican formula of gameplay. Some that come to mind are titles like Hurricane and Gunlord. And the whole idea that Turrican clones even exist is kind of interesting to me, since Turrican in of itself is a series that copies a lot of elements from games that came before it, like Metroid, Contra, and Psycho Nick's Oscar. In fact, many of Manfred Trench's games are clones of other games that were made at the time. But to be fair, Turrican does take its own unique spin on these design elements, and it does have its own sense of style that make it feel unique from something like Contra or Metroid. I do feel that many of these Turrican clones and fan games are basically the byproduct of the Turrican series basically being dead since the mid-90s, with Super Turrican 2 being the last official game to come out, and with every attempt at a Turrican game afterwards getting scrapped, trashed, and to never see the light of day. So, many of these Turrican clones try to fill the void of the series' absence. Today, we'll be taking a look at a particular Turrican clone that takes a little bit of a unique approach to the Turrican formula, that being Jack Razor Distant Dimension. So, without further ado, I present to you my review. Going into the game's performance, Jack Razor runs for the most part pretty smoothly. Although there are a couple of instances where the game experiences some frame drops and chugging, it never gets too bad that it becomes unbearable. The frame rate for the most part is rather smooth. As far as the presentation goes, I can see how the game's visuals may be a turnoff for some people, but I don't mind it too much. Some of the models do look kind of off to a certain extent, but the game overall looks alright, and in certain areas it can be kind of nice to look at. The art direction fulfills its purpose and does exactly what it needs to give the game its own identity. Some of the environments look really nice and colorful, my personal favorite being Stage 5-3, the Hazard's Factory. I really like how wacky and detailed it is, and furthermore, the parallax scrolling is really well done. The cutscenes, however, do look a little bit awkward, but given what the developers had to work with, it has to be acknowledged that they were at least trying their best. They are overall okay. The sound design is really well done though. The sound effects for collecting crystals, one-ups, and destroying enemies all hit the spot, and are really satisfying in conjunction with gameplay. The sound for collecting crystals really has a nice bop to it, and that's really nice to hear, especially when you find a whole stack of them. The soundtrack is really good. The music is really catchy and really fits the tone of what's going on in-game, whether the setting be energetic, calm, or intense. Most of the soundtrack is synthesized electronic goodness, but there are also some more orchestral sounding tracks, as well as some tribal sounding ones as well. The composition styling of the music in this game, if anything, kinda reminds me of Pac-Man World 2 to some degree. But with some Turrican influences thrown in there for good measure, which to me is pretty great. Overall, in the music department, it really excels. As far as the story goes, in 1994, a scientist by the name of Engelbeck develops technology for interdimensional travel, and discovers a space that may have been inhabited by an ancient civilization. This would, however, end up becoming his prison, as while presenting this dimension to his peers, an incident occurs where one of his bioengineered creatures ends up going maverick, leading to the presentation going disastrous. Being the one to blame, Engelbeck is then sent into exile in the same space he discovered, but before they could send him away, he hacked the portal field, giving it an energy source that would be set to reactivate the portal within the following 20 years, giving Engelbeck enough time to set up his army and plan out his revenge against the very society that punished him in the first place. Well, looks like somebody went to the jailed Robotnik school of evil scientists with vendettas against society. Cut to 2 decades later, in the year 2015, and we catch up with our protagonist, Jack Razor, a teenage mutant boy who was running away from his family after having his father lashed out at him. As for what it was all about, the game never fully explains. Then, all of a sudden, Engelbeck returns in a giant aircraft, demanding that he has rule over the world, while also sending out robots to terrorize the city. One day passes, and with no one taking a stand against Engelbeck, Jack, not willing to stand there and watch him commit war crimes, decides to put his foot down and take on the mad dictator's forces. Eventually, Jack runs into Lynn and Rebecca, 2 members of a resistance unit that is fighting against Engelbeck. Lynn explains to Jack that Engelbeck is trying to locate pieces of an amulet so he can use it to power his ultimate weapon, and that they need someone to go into the distant dimension to obtain the pieces of this amulet before Engelbeck can. Jack agrees to go along and help out, but this would be at the cost of him leaving his family behind, thus beginning Jack's adventure into the distant dimension. The plot is very simple and straight to the point, but it does its job and is really well made for a game of this caliber. There are many little nuances in the story, and there are a few things that the game leaves open to interpretation, which I really appreciate. The game's rating is pretty commendable. I do wish that the game did explore some of the characters more, but overall, what the game was able to provide with its story is good enough as is. After you get past the intro stage, there isn't much in the way of story progression. That is until you get halfway through World 4. By this time, the story takes a rather dark turn. I'm not going to spoil exactly what happens, but I will say that I like it a lot. It works with the story really well because it serves as the purpose of giving Jack motivation. Now, while it isn't entirely necessary, giving your character motivation can go a long way to make them feel more real, more engaging, and more relatable. And it makes the character's plight more interesting. And given all the factors here, Jack Razor utilizes this aspect really well. Overall, Jack Razor's plot is pretty decent, nothing groundbreaking, which you really shouldn't expect, but it does its job and serves the game quite nicely. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the most important aspect, the gameplay. In Jack Razor, you'll be running, jumping, and shooting your way to the goal, while also having the option to explore the more open-ended level design. Jack has 2 different projectile attacks, a Fire Blast and I don't really know what to call this one. I'll just call it a pea shooter for now, I guess. In conjunction with shooting enemies, you can also jump on some of them as well, which can also be really satisfying. Out of the 2 projectile attacks, the Fire Blast is easily the strongest, however it's practically ineffective against certain enemies. Meanwhile, the pea shooter, while it is weaker than the Fire Blast, it is however able to destroy any enemy that the Fire Blast can't. While on a surface level it didn't really seem like a big deal to me, when looking into it more, I began to realize how intricate it really is. While the combat in the Turrican series is about giving the player multiple options when taking on enemies, in the combat of this game, the enemy design is based around your abilities. With this whole emphasis on enemy interaction being tied to specific actions, a whole new layer of strategy is involved, and what really complements all of this is the strategic enemy placement and the enemy variety. And can I just praise the latter for the moment? Because the game's enemy variety is really good, almost every level introduces a new enemy variant, and by the time you get to Worlds 4 and 5, the overall enemy placement gets really good. With some enemy variants like the Rock Monster, your options aren't just limited to killing them. Alternatively, you can use some enemies as a form of transportation, which is really fucking neat, and a little bit funny. Hell, there is even one level that utilizes this as a platforming gimmick. Unfortunately, once you get the fire dash, or if you get the fire dash at all this intricacy kinda gets thrown out the window, as you can basically use it to curb stomp every enemy in the game, pretty much trivializing the whole strategy aspect. However, I must stress that this really isn't that big of an issue. For one thing, the fire dash isn't something that comes to you for free. You can only obtain it through the game's in-game currency, and you'll also need that same currency if you want to unlock Worlds 2 and 3, so it's really a matter of if you want to get any of the upgrades first, or if you just want to progress in the game first. Secondly, it's completely optional. You can go through the entire game without even needing to get any of the upgrades. The very core of this game is freedom of choice. How you approach the game is entirely up to you. And since I brought it up, I might as well talk about the two purchasable abilities for Jack, the previously mentioned Fire Dash and the Super Jump. You obtain these through the game's shop located within the hub world. The Super Jump allows you to reach vertical areas that would be otherwise unreachable, and the Fire Dash allows you to reach horizontal areas that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get to. These abilities overall add to the whole exploration aspect of the game. The level design utilizes these abilities well, and overall they add to the game's replay value. However, and unfortunately, while they did add another layer of interactivity to the game, with my experience playing with a controller, however, they make the input feel more finicky and glitchy. I often find myself performing the fire dash and long jumps that I never even intended to do, leading to some unfair deaths. But again, let me stress that I only experienced this when playing on a controller. Playing on keyboard, the game functions just fine. Heck, I'm not even sure if this is really an issue with the game. It could really just be an issue with my controller. You see, I've had this edgy color on an Xbox 360 controller since 2016, and it wouldn't be hard to imagine that the right shoulder button may be wearing out, so there's a good chance I'm just bringing up an issue that doesn't even exist. But while we're on the subject of keyboard controls, I must mention that when playing with the keyboard, up is to jump. Wait guys, calm down for a second. It's not bad at all. In fact, it works extremely well for this game. You have full control over your jumps. You can control how high you jump and how fast you land. It's overall really nice. Also, by continuously tapping the jump button, you can slow down your descent and sort of hover. Kinda like the leaf power-up in Mario 3. This makes some of the harder jumps a little easier to handle. The controls are overall good, but there are a couple of collision detection issues, and yeah, it can get annoying, but it's really not that bad. The level design is good. The platform placement is handled with care and is really well thought out, and each platform is within reach. My only complaint with the level design is that sometimes your depth perception isn't entirely helpful, but that's merely the extent of my issues. The exploration can be fun, and finding a secret area full of crystals and one-ups can feel really rewarding and satisfying. All this combined with the game's well thought out enemy placement overall results into some really good game design. Furthermore, the environment variety is also pretty neat. This stage, and this stage all take place within the same world, yet they feel different from each other, and that's just one example I can make. And on the subject of variety, there are also some sections where the game deviates from its regular platforming gameplay, with a water bike section and 3 different shmup levels. I honestly really don't like the water bike stage, mainly because I don't like how it controls, but thankfully it's only used for one boss fight. The shmup levels, on the other hand, are really a nice change of pace, and are pretty good overall. Aside from being the area where you select what level to go to, the hub world is also home to some additional content. One of these is the previously mentioned in-game shop run by Sid, a rather wacky individual who has some admittedly pretty funny dialogue. Sid's shop is where you'll be able to purchase the Fire Dash and the Super Jump, but this is also where you'll be able to purchase access to certain aspects of Paula's arcade. Yeah, that's right, there's an in-game arcade, and it's kinda like the one in Pac-Man World 2. This section includes a music hall, which lets you listen to the whole game's soundtrack, challenge levels, which have some really nice music, and Theatron, an overhead shmup that was actually a previous game from the developer. Overall, a nice couple of bonuses. Now here's the point where I talk about the post-game content and also somewhat spoil the final boss. So if you don't want any of this spoiled for you, then skip to this time frame. So after beating the final boss, there is still one more level you can go to, but in order to unlock it, you have to obtain all 15 power crystals. 2 of them are already given to you from the get-go. 5 of them are hidden in each of the 5 worlds. The other 5 you obtain through completing the challenge levels, and the remaining 3 you get from Sid. As for the stage itself, it's pretty much a shitpost level, and that's really great in my opinion. More games need to add shitpost levels, or just shitpost content in general. The level itself isn't particularly hard, but it's still a nice little extra. Oh, and the stage also ends with a boss rush. After beating it, the game rewards you with maxed out lives and score. And I covered pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. All in all, Jak Racer Distant Dimension is a well-designed, competent, and charming game that successfully does what it sets out to do. Though it is admittedly rough around the edges in certain areas, but I still do have an enjoyable time playing through it, and whenever I do play it, I often find myself compelled to 100% complete it. This game is pretty much a passion project where the developers put as much effort into making it as good as they possibly could, despite the limitations they had to face, and it really shows. If this game is proof of anything, it's that Apex Squared Studios has potential, and I look forward to whatever future project they take on. In fact, one of the 3 developers who made this game, most specifically the lead developer, is also working on a Pac-Man World fan game titled Pac-Man World: The Revenge of Spooky, and needless to say, I hope this particular fan project comes to fruition. With all that said, if you're thirsty for anything Turrican-like, or if you were just looking for an enjoyable or intuitive platformer, then I'd recommend Jak Racer. You can get it for $7 on either GameJolt or itch.io. Anyways, I'll see you all later.